Hi everyone. I'm so sorry I'm not able to be there with you this evening as I'm on a conference, as you can see. But Miri has asked me just to say 5 minutes about the tools that I found really useful in preparing Bible studies, what and why sentences. And nothing is original to me. I'm basically pinching all of this from how I was taught, and I found it really useful, and so I hope that it will be for you too. But before we look at the tools together, it's worth just saying the really obvious thing that you'll already be thinking, which is before we get anywhere near the tools and writing our sentences, we must be praying for ourselves as we dig into the Bible, because only by God's Spirit that we have any chance of understanding it. It's only by God's power that we can understand it rightly so that we would change, which is the goal. But the same is also true for the people who are involved in our Bible study, who will be there on the night, and so we need to be praying for them as well as ourselves as we work on the passage, praying that God in his power would help us. So make sure you're doing that. And the second thing, of course, is these tools that we're going to look at together, they're only useful insofar as we've thought really hard about whatever passage the Bible study is on. It's not a shortcut. In fact, in some ways it makes it harder and longer. And so we need to think really carefully, read and reread and think deeply about the passage before we can start using these tools to help us deliver a Bible study that's hopefully useful. And so if you haven't read something like Dig Deeper, would be really, really helpful to give you some things to think about. What sorts of questions should I be asking as I look through the text? But anyway, let's dive into what and why sentences.
Right, so what is a what sentence? It is essentially what you think the big thing is that the author is teaching in this passage. Now, there might be lots of things that the author says in the passage, particularly if it's a longer one, and the author might be wanting to teach lots of different ideas, and you might be able to see lots of different ideas, but this tool helps us to focus down on what do you think is the big thing that the author is teaching. It should be a statement of fact, so not like a command, like things must be this way or should be done like that, but things that are, and ideally not more than 12 words long. And that's arbitrary, but essentially it just forces us to make decisions about what is most important, what's the big thing, rather than listing all the things. Essentially, it just makes us work harder and think more clearly. It doesn't mean that we're kind of leaving bits out of the passage. In fact, it means we've thought hard about them to work out which things are most important and how they're relating together. So I always find examples make things a lot clearer. So here's a couple of examples to help us. Faith is not a great what sentence. I mean, it's not even a sentence, but essentially that's just a topic that is plucked out of the passage at random. It might be even the biggest topic in the passage, but we don't know what the author's teaching about it. Faith saves, still not great, but it's better because we're learning what is the author teaching about faith? It's that it saves. In this next example, we're trying to move beyond kind of a mere description of what's happening in the passage. Jesus feeds 5,000 would be true for that passage, but what the author is teaching, it goes far beyond that. You might go for something like, he is the Lord who provides for his people, and that's what we're learning by Jesus feeding 5,000, perhaps. This one's very similar indeed. It's not just describing what the passage says. So it's true that in Ephesians 1, Paul prays for them to know God's power. But we want to know what's the author teaching about God's power. Why is Paul praying for it? Well, this is really bland, but even this is better. It's really important for God's people to know God's power. And that's why we're told that Paul's praying for them, perhaps. This final example for what sentences. We don't just want to repeat the command that's in the passage, even if the command you think is the biggest thing. Put to death what is earthly in you, I think is probably the heart of that bit in Colossians. But what's the author teaching about that command? The very least you should do is turn it into a statement rather than a command. Those raised with Christ must put to death what is earthly in them. What are we being taught? That it's essential for Christians to do this. And not just Christians, but as Paul describes us, those who are raised with Christ, gives you a bit more of the flavour of what he's saying. So that's our whistle-stop tour through what sentences. Why sentences then are the response that you think the author is seeking in his readers. Essentially, everything that you ever write or say is meant to do something, to achieve something in the people who hear or read it. And the Bible is no different to that at all. Everything you write or say, you want it to do something, to have an impact. You've got a purpose for it. It's not just random. And so this why sentence is our attempt to kind of express what we think the author is trying to do in the passage, because that is what God is intending it for it to do in us, and therefore what we are trying to do with our Bible study in the people who are there. It is literally the purpose that it was written for and why it exists. It's worth just saying this works on a kind of book level as well. A book is trying to achieve essentially one purpose, even if it's quite a broad purpose. It's not like chapter 1 of Ephesians is trying to do something totally different from chapter 5 of Ephesians. It's one letter that Paul wants to do one big thing in. But obviously each little section of a book is going to contribute to that overall purpose in a different way. Say you think a book is trying to generate greater holiness in the readers. Maybe it does that by helping them feel the horror of sin and then the privilege of holiness, and then explaining practically what holy living looks like. 3 kind of separate parts contributing to one overall purpose. Anyway, our purpose statements, we're hoping, are commands with single main verbs. So rather than just saying what things are, like in our what sentences, we're trying to give an action for it, a command. This must be this way, you should do that. And again, I think it shouldn't be more than 12 words long. Let's look at some examples together to help us understand a bit more. Sometimes we get confused with purpose and application. Application is kind of things that would be good for us to do in response to the passage, whereas the purpose, the why sentence, is why has the author written it? So you might think go for a walk in God's creation is a good thing that you should do after reading Genesis 1, but it wouldn't be a great why sentence. Something more like be awestruck. That's what Moses is doing with Genesis 1. Be awestruck by God's creative power. It's the response that the author is aiming for. Next up then, and we're not just I remember the thing I said about books have a big purpose and each section contributes to it. And we don't just want to restate the command of any kind of local passage purpose. So in Ephesians 5, Paul commands husbands to love their wives. It's not a great why sentence because you kind of want to fit that into the whole purpose of the book. Like you maybe haven't thought hard enough about why Paul wants husbands to love their wives. Maybe it's something like husbands reflect God's plan of unity, which is what the book is all about, by loving your wives. How about this one then? Not just kind of restating what the passage is saying, but adding the word know or understand, which is basically always true. And it's not a bad thing necessarily to have a purpose statement that is understand something better. That's often true. But we can think harder about why the author wants us to know or understand something. So instead of understand Jesus as creator, wonder at the power of Jesus as creator. Something like that for Colossians 1. So we've taken a look at what sentences and why sentences, what we think the big thing the author is teaching in the passage, and why has the author written it? What response is he looking for? We looked at those 2 rules. It's a statement of fact or a command with no more than 12 words. And here's 2 more rules that would be helpful for us to think through. Both of them, the what and the why, should apply to the original hearers, the them then, the church in Ephesus, for example, but also to us, the small group that meets in your house. We'll talk about why in a second. And then the last rule is that as far as possible, use the language that the passage itself uses, rather than kind of imposing our own meaning onto it. Let's look at some examples because I think it'll make it slightly clearer. So for this first thing about it applying to both sets, again, it just helps us be a bit more clear. So instead of Israel should submit to King David, which is a really accurate statement for them then, you might think, but is not very relevant to us today. It feels a bit more like a history lesson. You might go for God's people should submit to God's king. Very relevant to us today. But you could fall off the other end and be so relevant to us today that it means nothing to the people in 1 Samuel. Christians should submit to Jesus. Well, that just doesn't mean anything in the context of the Old Testament. But again, God's people should submit to God's king. It relates to both them then, Israel, and us now, Christians, submitting to God's king David, or now to Jesus. Finally then, this thing about using the language of the passage, essentially it's just to help us to be clear, not fitting our own ideas into the text, but making the text change the way we think rather than the other way around. So you might see Christ again and again in the passage and think, oh, that's just a synonym for Jesus. I'll put Jesus because it's more understandable. But you lose something because Christ, a technical word, God's anointed king. Maybe the author is particularly pointing out something about Jesus' kingship in this passage, which you dulled by changing the word to Jesus. You get the same thing with Lord. Lord, God's kind of Old Testament personal covenant name to his people. You lose a lot of that when you squash it down to something more generic like God. We've looked at some examples in Colossians. Heaven is one way that we might talk about things above, but you lose some of the nuance of the passage and you bring in some of our kind of contemporary ideas about clouds and stuff. So it's just a helpful rule to think as much as possible, use the language the passage uses.